They called her just a nurse. 3 years of 12-hour shifts, 247 patients stabilized in the ICU, and nobody at Mercy General knew that the woman pushing the medication cart had once coordinated mass casualty evacuations under mortar fire. They didn't know. He didn't know. And that was exactly how she needed it. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song as Brooke Sullivan moved through the third-floor corridors of Mercy General in Denver, her scrubs the color of storm clouds, her hand steady as surgical steel. The hospital smelled like bleach and something else, that particular cologne of antiseptic mixed with human pain that never quite washed out of the walls. Her badge clipped to her waistband read simply, B. Sullivan, RN. Nothing more. She preferred it that way. Her hands were calloused. Not the soft, manicured hands of someone who'd lived a normal life. These were hands that had held pressure dressings against arterial bleeds in the dark, that had guided chest tubes through rib cages, that had learned the precise angle of a needle decompression at the second intercostal space before she was old enough to drink legally. Her colleagues noticed the calluses sometimes, the way her thumbs were permanently slightly curved from years of muscle memory that had nothing to do with starting fours. They assumed it was burnout. Overwork. The price of nursing. They were wrong about almost everything. Brooke had arrived at Mercy General 3 years ago with a sealed file and a name that wasn't originally hers. The government had been very clear about the terms: disappear, live quietly, touch nothing that mattered. A Black Ops extraction gone sideways in Sangin Valley had ended with 3 of her operators bleeding out in a safe house while she held them together with gauze and prayer. The official record said it never happened. Senior Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan had been erased from every database that mattered, her service record locked behind classified walls, her existence officially dust. So she became a floor nurse in Denver, pushing medications for $12 an hour above minimum wage, watching younger doctors make decisions she could have made better with her eyes closed. The 1,000-yard stare came free with the job. That distant quality in her eyes when she looked at the monitor displays, as if she was seeing something beyond the numbers. Her co-workers attributed it to the emotional weight of nursing. To compassion fatigue. The soul-crushing reality of holding people's hands while they died. They weren't entirely wrong about that part. She had held hands while people died, just profoundly wrong about where that experience came from. This morning, like every morning, she touched the pair of worn combat boots in the bottom of her locker before clocking in. The leather was cracked from 3 tours of duty, the soles worn thin from patrol routes through Helmand Province. She couldn't explain why she kept them. Sentimentality wasn't something she could afford. But every shift, her thumb ran across the rough canvas of the bootlace, and she remembered exactly who she'd been before she stopped existing. The medication room at Mercy General hummed with its own particular rhythm. 3 refrigerators for temperature-controlled drugs, a locked cabinet for narcotics, shelves of supplies stacked with mechanical precision. Brooke moved through this space with the efficiency of muscle memory, pulling 4 bags, checking orders, her eyes scanning the medication logs with the kind of attention that came from having once been responsible for keeping people alive in conditions that made hospitals look like luxury spas. It was during the 11 a.m. medication round that she noticed the first discrepancy. A surgical kit billed to Medicare for $847, dated March 14th. The order form said it arrived on the floor. But Brooke had worked March 14th. She remembered the day, a quiet Tuesday, only 2 surgical patients, neither of whom required a high-level emergency kit. She double-checked the supply cabinet. Nothing matched the order. The kit was phantom. A ghost. Just like she was. Over the next week, she found 4 more. Phantom surgical kits. Advanced diagnostic equipment that never materialized. Supplies billed at double their wholesale cost to a vendor that didn't appear on any of Mercy General's legitimate supplier lists. The pattern was unmistakable to someone trained to see patterns, and Brooke had been trained very well. During her lunch break on Friday, she sat in the break room with a cup of coffee that had been cooling for 20 minutes and carefully cross-referenced the supply manifests against the billing records. Her hands didn't shake. Her jaw didn't clench. She simply documented what she found with the methodical precision of someone filing a situation report. The break room smelled like microwaved leftovers and the particular staleness of a space where nobody lingered long. Jenny Chen from the night shift was making a sandwich at the counter when Brooke looked up from the billing papers. Jenny's husband was military, something in logistics at the Air Force Academy. She sometimes mentioned her brother-in-law in hushed tones, a lieutenant colonel who'd done something important with the special forces. The kind of thing you didn't talk about at dinner parties. "Did you catch the news about Dr. Hargrove?" Jenny asked, keeping her voice low. "My husband mentioned he saw him at the Aspen property showing last weekend. The guy just bought a place for $2.3 million. Cash offer. How does a hospitalist do that on salary?" Brooke didn't answer immediately. She sipped her cold coffee, the bitterness cutting across her tongue like a familiar weapon. "People make interesting financial choices sometimes," she said quietly. "If you look closely at the supply orders from the last year, you can see exactly how interesting." She said it as a fact. Not an accusation. Not a concern. Just data. But Jenny's face went pale, and she stopped making her sandwich. When you worked in a hospital, you learned quickly that there were truths you could speak aloud and truths that got filed away in careful silence. Jenny Chen closed the lid on the bread and walked out of the break room without finishing. That was Thursday at 2:27 p.m. By Friday morning, the break room felt different. Brooke pushed open the swinging door at 7:15 a.m., and the ambient temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. 3 nurses were gathered near the coffee maker, Carol from orthopedics, Martinez from cardiology, and Susan from the day shift supervisor's office. They were discussing staffing for the afternoon when Brooke approached. The moment she entered the space, the conversation stopped. Not naturally. Not the way conversations naturally pause. It stopped like someone had flipped a switch. Carol grabbed her coffee cup with an urgency that suggested the building was on fire. Martinez suddenly remembered she needed to check something in the supply closet. Susan looked at a spot on the wall directly above Brooke's head and kept her eyes fixed there, her jaw set like concrete. Brooke didn't pause. Didn't acknowledge it. She moved to the coffee maker with the same steady efficiency she used for everything, filled her cup, and left. Her back felt the weight of eyes that wouldn't meet hers. That was the thing about the 1,000-yard stare, it trained your peripheral vision to see things people didn't think you could see. She had worked enough military operations to recognize a coordinated action when she saw one. By Monday, a fabricated disciplinary write-up appeared on the unit bulletin board. Pattern of procedural violations, it read in clinical language. Unauthorized access to patient files. Failure to follow proper chain of command. The signature at the bottom read, Dr. James Hargrove, attending physician. Brooke read it once while standing at the unit desk, then continued preparing her 9 a.m. medications without changing her expression. The write-up was a lie constructed with surgical precision. Professional. Institutional. The kind of thing that would sound official to anyone who didn't know enough to look deeper. She knew exactly why he'd done it. Dr. Hargrove had been at Mercy General for 7 years, which meant he'd had 7 years to build a network. He had friends in administration. Friends in billing. Friends who owed him favors or who benefited from his particular brand of entrepreneurship. He was the kind of powerful that came quietly, not through titles or authority, but through leverage. The kind of power that came from knowing people's secrets and keeping them safe. And now he knew she knew about his. On Tuesday morning, Dr. Hargrove appeared on the 3rd floor during her medication rounds. He stood at the nursing station, watching her through the glass walls of the med room with his hands in his pockets. He was a man constructed from expensive tailoring, a $1,500 watch, cufflinks that probably cost more than her monthly rent, shoes polished to a mirror shine that suggested he'd never actually walked anywhere on them. His presence made the air pressure change, like standing next to something predatory that hadn't decided whether to eat you yet. Their eyes met for exactly 2 seconds. He smiled. It was the smile of someone who'd just moved a piece on a chessboard and was waiting to see if you'd noticed. Then he turned and walked away, his shoes making whisper-soft sounds on the tile floor. Brooke returned to the medication cart and continued her rounds without missing a beat. But her mind was already several moves ahead, calculating angles and possibilities the way she'd learned to calculate them in the mountains of Helmand province. He was going to escalate. Not today. Maybe not this week. But it was coming. She could feel it the way she'd once felt incoming mortars through the ground beneath her feet. He was building something, and she was the problem he intended to solve. That was what happened to people who paid attention in the wrong way. That was what happened when you saw things that powerful men wanted to keep invisible. She had one advantage, though. One small edge that Dr. Hargrove didn't even know existed. She had survived things worse than office politics. She had survived Sangin Valley. She had survived being legally erased from existence. She had survived becoming nobody at all. What happened next didn't arrive as a warning. Room 304 smelled like antiseptic and fear. Mr. Patterson lay on the bed, his left arm extended for the fall line, and his entire family had crowded into the space, daughter with her phone already recording, wife gripping the bed rail, grandson eating crackers from a sleeve he shouldn't have brought into the sterile environment. Brooke had inserted 14-gauge cannulas into patients for 3 years without incident. Her hands moved with the fluid precision of muscle memory earned in field hospitals where veins were harder to find and mistakes cost lives. But Dr. Hargrove was watching from the doorway, his presence making the air pressure change like a storm front moving in. "Nurse Sullivan, did you even check which vein you're fishing around in, or are you just guessing?" His voice dripped contempt, clinical and cutting, designed to land with surgical precision. Patterson's daughter tilted her phone toward Brooke. "Perhaps Clipboard Sally here needs to go back to nursing school. Oh wait, which online program did you graduate from again?" The room went dead silent. Patterson's grandson stopped chewing. The wife's knuckles whitened on the bed rail. Brooke's hands didn't stop moving. The needle entered the cephalic vein cleanly, the catheter seated perfectly, blood flashing back into the chamber with a tiny hiss that only she could hear. She secured the line with tape, checked the placement, confirmed patency. One measured breath. A single tear tracked down her cheek as she maintained unwavering eye contact with Hargrove, then she wiped it away with her thumb in a gesture that looked like weakness to everyone in the room except the colonel in the hospital bed next door who had once watched combat medics operate under fire. "The 4 is patent, doctor. Your patient is comfortable." Her voice was iron-wrapped in silk. Hargrove's jaw clenched. He'd expected her to stammer, to apologize, to shrink. Instead she'd simply finished the procedure while his insult hung in the air like smoke. He turned on his heel and left without responding, which somehow made it worse, the kind of dismissal that said her answer wasn't worth acknowledging. The tactical humiliation was only the opening move. 2 days later, Brooke sat in the break room with her lunch, a container of rice and grilled chicken she'd prepared at home, nothing worth stealing, nothing that mattered. Jenny was there, and Marcus from night shift, and Patricia who'd worked every Christmas for 5 years without complaint. They were mid-conversation about the new ventilator protocols, but the moment Brooke pulled out her chair, Jenny grabbed her lunch mid-bite. Marcus turned toward the refrigerator. Patricia stood abruptly, her chair scraping against tile. Within 30 seconds, the break room was empty except for Brooke, the fluorescent lights humming overhead like insects trapped in plastic, and the sound of her own breathing. She ate anyway. Slow. Methodical. The way she'd eaten in forward operating bases when mortar rounds landed close enough to shake the walls. This happened 3 shifts in a row. The break room exodus. The engineered silence. The surgical removal of her from the social fabric of the unit, orchestrated with the precision of someone who understood institutional power the way a conductor understands an orchestra. But that wasn't the worst part. The disciplinary write-up appeared on the unit board during morning shift change, typed in the official hospital format with Dr. Hargrove's name printed at the bottom as the reporting physician. Brooke stood at the bulletin board reading the words, "Pattern of procedural violations, insubordinate conduct, failure to maintain professional boundaries, inconsistent charting practices." None of it was real. All of it was devastating. Every nurse would read it during handoff. Every nurse would wonder. Every nurse would be careful around Clipboard Sally now, careful not to be seen talking to her, careful not to let the contamination spread. Brooke removed the write-up from the board, folded it calmly, and placed it in her pocket. Her jaw was tight. That was the only thing she allowed herself, the muscle clench that said restraint, not fear. At 1,400 hours, Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Chen's name appeared in her assignment roster. Post-op day 1 from a routine cholecystectomy, no complications, stable vitals. Gallbladder removal surgery, the kind of procedure that should keep a man in a hospital bed for 36 hours, then send him home. Her hands froze on the keyboard when she read his name. Marcus Chen. Her son's commanding officer from the Sangin deployment. The man who'd sent David to a field hospital with shrapnel in his left thigh and a Purple Heart coming home in his dress uniform. The man who'd written her personally, "Your son is the bravest person I know. I trust him with my life." She kept her distance professionally. No favoritism. No acknowledgement that their worlds had intersected before this moment. But when Chen's wife visited that afternoon, the woman hugged Brooke in the hallway with the kind of warmth that came from genuine feeling. "David talks about you constantly," Mrs. Chen said, her voice warm. "Says you're the strongest person he knows." Brooke's throat tightened. She murmured something appropriate and moved on, but she was watching Chen's room more carefully now. Not inappropriately. Just the way a trained medic watches a patient when something isn't right. His surgical drain output was darker than what should have been charted. Serous fluid, yes, but darker than the morning note indicated. His respiratory rate had climbed from 16 breaths per minute at shift change to 22 over 6 hours, a subtle increase that might have been pain or anxiety, but she'd seen enough combat casualties to know what early compensation looked like. She documented everything carefully, flagged the on-call resident, stepped back. That's when Dr. Hargrove appeared in Chen's doorway during evening rounds. His face was tight. Controlled. He was hunting. "Nurse Sullivan, step into the hallway." Chen's wife was sitting in the corner chair. The unit charge nurse was passing by with a medication cart. Hargrove wanted witnesses. He wanted this recorded in the institutional consciousness the same way he'd recorded the fabricated write-up. In the hallway, his voice dropped to a controlled hiss. "You're not assigned to this patient. Not anymore. Accessing his chart the way you have, this is a HIPAA violation. Unauthorized chart review without clinical justification. I was assigned to Colonel Chen this morning." Brooke's voice stayed level, clinical. The voice of someone following protocol. The assignment board. The board was updated at 1400. Hargrove cut her off, his eyes like flint. "You've been reassigned. This is exactly the kind of boundary violation we've documented in your file. The kind of pattern that concerns our compliance team." He was using the write-up as a weapon. The fabricated violations suddenly seemed credible because they were part of a documented pattern. One violation supported the next. The lie had infrastructure now. Chen's wife appeared in the doorway behind Hargrove, confused. The charge nurse paused, pretending not to listen while definitely listening. Brooke took one measured breath. Let a single tear track down her cheek as she maintained unwavering eye contact with Hargrove. Wiped it away with her thumb. "Colonel Chen's care deserves better than theater, doctor. Perhaps we should discuss your supply orders instead." The words landed like a grenade with a delayed fuse. Hargrove's face went white, then red. His jaw worked soundlessly for a moment. "You're off this floor. Effective immediately. HR will contact you." He pulled his phone from his pocket as he stalked past, already dialing, his voice tight as he moved down the hallway. "Yes, it's Hargrove. I need to speak with Patricia from Board Compliance. It's about Nurse Sullivan. I have documentation of HIPAA violations." Brooke clocked out 20 minutes later, her shift officially over, her employment officially under investigation. Her locker still smelled like hospital laundry and old bleach. At the bottom, underneath her spare scrubs and her personal items, sat the combat boots she'd worn in Sangin. Brown leather, scuffed and stained with dust from mountains she couldn't discuss and blood from people whose names she'd promised to carry silently. She touched the left boot, her thumb running along the crease where her ankle met the leather. Her phone buzzed. A text from Jenny. He called 3 board members and someone from the state medical board. Be careful. Brooke drove home through Denver traffic with the radio off, her hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel the way she'd been taught in driver's education a lifetime ago. She couldn't defend herself with the truth. The truth was classified. The truth was that Senior Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan had been ordered to disappear after a Black Ops extraction in Sangin went sideways, her record scrubbed, her existence officially erased by a government that understood that some mistakes were too expensive to leave in the system. 3 tours. 2 Purple Hearts. A Navy Cross hanging in a frame that didn't exist anymore. All of it archived in a file that didn't legally exist either. Dr. Hargrove was building his case methodically, and she had no legal mechanism to defend herself because her entire military history was sealed behind classification levels that would require a Pentagon signature to access. She parked in her driveway as the sun set over Denver, and she understood with crystalline clarity that she was about to lose everything she'd built in this quiet life, all because she'd made the mistake of looking too carefully at what Dr. Hargrove was stealing. The surgical drain output was darker than it should have been. Brooke noticed it at 2:44 p.m., the fluid in the collection bulb a rust brown instead of the pale pink it had been that morning. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Chen's respiratory rate had climbed too. She'd counted it 3 separate times, watching the rise and fall of his chest, 16 breaths per minute at noon, 18 at 2 o'clock, 22 by 3:15. The monitors showed it all in their mechanical rhythm, beeping their indifferent song while the on-call resident, Dr. Marcus Webb, a thin-faced man in his 2nd year, stood at the bedside reviewing Chen's chart with the distracted air of someone checking boxes. Brooke approached him in the hallway outside Chen's room, her voice low and steady. His drain output changed color since this morning. Darker. And his respiratory rates climbing. She'd learned not to make it a question. Facts. Data. No emotion. 6 breath increase in 6 hours isn't routine post-op variation. Dr. Webb glanced up from the chart, his eyes already sliding away from hers. Hargrove cleared him for standard post-operative recovery this morning. Drain output varies based on activity level. Nothing alarming. He paused, a flicker of something, uncertainty? Fear, crossing his face before he continued. Actually, Dr. Hargrove restricted your access to Chen's chart. You're not supposed to be reviewing his detailed vitals without direct supervision. The words hung between them like a blade. Brooke had known it was coming. She'd been waiting for the institutional leverage to tighten. But knowing and experiencing were different magnitudes of pain. His oxygen saturation still good, she asked, keeping her voice in the measured register of a subordinate asking for clarification. 92% on room air. Normal for post-op. Dr. Webb shifted his weight, a man already committed to the version of events Dr. Hargrove had constructed for him. He'll be discharged tomorrow if vitals stay stable. Hargrove was very clear about the expected recovery trajectory. Brooke nodded once, slowly, a gesture that communicated nothing. She'd learned to respond to injustice the way she'd learned to respond to incoming fire, with breath, with stillness, with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. But underneath, her combat medic brain was running the numbers. Dark fluid. Climbing respiratory rate. Oxygen saturation dropping by 2 percentage points in 6 hours was a trend, not a data point. Trends were predictions. She was still calculating when the reassignment appeared on the staffing board at 3:45 p.m. One line printed in the scheduling system, Sullivan, evening shift, floors 4 to 6. Chen was on floor 3. It was precise, surgical, the kind of institutional maneuvering that left no fingerprints. Hargrove hadn't assigned her a different floor. He'd simply reassigned her from Chen's unit. Deniable. Professional. Devastating. A nurse named Marcus Chen needed monitoring. A nurse named Brooke Sullivan could not provide it. She finished her shift on floor 4, moving through rooms with the ghost of her own competence, checking vitals on a pneumonia patient and a post-gallbladder woman who didn't know that her nurse was somewhere else entirely, somewhere in Sangin, watching a patrol route in the dark, listening to a radio frequency that no longer carried her voice. At 5:43 p.m., she clocked out and walked through the Denver evening air that smelled of rain coming and asphalt cooling and the particular emptiness of leaving a place where you'd been systematically erased. She was home by 6:15. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the sound of water running through the pipes from upstairs. Old building, old plumbing, sounds that used to feel like peace and now felt like a countdown. She'd changed into civilian clothes, yoga pants and a grey thermal shirt, her hair down for the first time in days, the kind of small surrender that comes when you stop fighting the dissolution of your own life. She was standing at the kitchen sink, glass of water in hand, when the phone rang at 6:58 p.m. It was Jenny, Chen's wife. Her voice was fractured. "It's Colonel Chen. He's crashing. Oxygen saturation dropped to 84% in the last 30 minutes. His breathing is wrong, really wrong, and the resident doesn't know what to do and nobody can find Dr. Hargrove," and Jenny's voice broke. "He's getting worse. I can see it. His lips are blue. His neck veins are they supposed to look like that?" Brooke's hand moved first, setting the glass down with the precision of someone who'd learned not to let panic make you clumsy. "Tracheal deviation?" His head tilted toward one side or the other. "Yes. Yes, his head's tilted left and he's having trouble breathing and the monitor is alarming Anne. Breath sounds on the right side of his chest." A pause. Jenny was learning to hear the urgency underneath the calm. "Nothing. I can't hear anything. Tension pneumothorax. Air in the chest cavity, compressing the lung, collapsing it, pushing the heart away from its chambers." 6 hours after a drain removal or a post-surgical complication she'd predicted and watched develop and been systematically removed from preventing. The human body doesn't care about institutional politics. It just dies. Brooke was already moving, already grabbing her keys from the hook by the door, her old combat boots, the ones with the soles worn thin, the laces that had been tied in 100 forward operating bases, still sitting in her locker from the afternoon. She was in her car in 43 seconds, the engine turning over with a sound like a ragged breath, and she was driving back to Mercy General while Jenny stayed on the line, feeding her numbers like prayer. Sats at 84, still dropping. 82 now. His heart rate's 138. His wife is screaming and the resident's just standing there and nobody's doing anything. The code cart's in the hallway. I think so. I can see one down there, but they need a 14-gauge catheter. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. That's where the needle goes. Brooke's voice had shifted an octave lower, the timid nurse dissolved away, replaced by something that moved like apex predators, like muscle memory, like someone who'd done this before with shrapnel falling and no one answering comms. "Tell them that. Tell them now. If they wait for Hargrove, he'll be dead before the needle goes in." The drive took 5 minutes 47 seconds. She parked illegally in the ER bay and was moving through the doors while her hands were still settling into that space between civilian and operative, the transformation that lived in her muscle fibers and nerve endings. The night shift security guard, Tommy, who worked weekends and knew her by sight, tried to stop her at the stairwell. "Sullivan, you're not cleared for." She didn't slow down. She didn't apologize. She simply moved, the kind of movement that communicated with absolute clarity that resistance was decorative, and Tommy had sense enough not to physically engage someone whose eyes had gone flat and whose voice, when she spoke, sounded like a .50 caliber round being chambered. "Patient in distress, floor 3, room 307. I'm providing emergency response. Stand down." She was in the stairwell before he finished processing the sentence. Floor 3 was chaos rendered in fluorescent light, the kind of controlled panic that happens when medicine breaks and nobody knows how to fix it. Chen's door was open. His wife stood against the wall, hand over her mouth. The young resident, Dr. Webb, stood frozen at the bedside with the expression of a man watching a car crash he couldn't prevent. And in the bed, Chen's lips were the color of slate, his chest heaving against the effort of breathing that shouldn't have been an effort, his neck veins distended like they might burst through the skin. The code cart sat 3 feet away, abandoned. Brooke picked up the 14-gauge angiocath needle, hands moving, muscle memory activated, and she moved to Chen's side. She palpated the second intercostal space, the anatomical landmark that lived in her hands from 1,000 training scenarios and 100 field operations, and she felt the rib margin where the needle needed to go. Her own breathing stayed level. Her hand stayed steady. She didn't ask for permission. The needle went in with the soft, decisive resistance of bone, and then the hiss. The sound of air escaping under pressure, the sound of a pneumothorax decompressing, the sound of a man getting his life back. It filled the room like a gunshot in reverse, and Chen's chest expanded, and his oxygen saturation climbed on the monitor, 84, 86, 88, 92, and his breathing changed from the frantic gasping of drowning to something almost human, almost survivable. His eyes opened. His head turned. And he looked at Brooke's face with the sudden, shocked recognition of a man seeing a ghost. "Reaper," he whispered. The single word hung in the air like a gunshot after echo. Brooke's face went pale. Just for a moment. Just the briefest flicker before her composure reassembled itself. But the word had landed. Reaper. The call sign she'd left behind in Sangin, the identity that was supposed to be classified and erased, the name that belonged to a senior chief petty officer who'd been officially dead for 3 years. And then the doors burst open. Dr. Hargrove arrived with 2 hospital administrators in expensive suits and a look on his face like a man who'd already won. Behind him came 2 board members, one Brooke recognized from the lobbying firm that handled the hospital's political interests. His network. Activated. Armed. Security, Dr. Hargrove said, his voice carrying the tone of a man issuing commands to his own soldiers. This nurse has been restricted from patient care. Remove her from this room immediately. But that wasn't the worst part. Security moved toward her like a closing fist, but Brooke was already past them, 3 strides, 4, her legs remembering how to move through chaos when every second meant survival. The ICU corridor compressed around her, the fluorescent lights casting everything in a sickly white that reminded her of the medical tent at forward operating base Shank, and her hands were already steady as she reached Chen's room and found him drowning in his own chest. 71% oxygen saturation. His rib cage heaving like a man trying to breathe through a collapsed lung, because that's exactly what was happening. Tension pneumothorax. The lung had folded in on itself, pressing against his heart, compressing his vessels. Every breath was pulling him deeper underwater. His eyes found hers and she saw the recognition there, saw him trying to say something but the words wouldn't come, just gasps and that thin whistling sound of a man whose airway was betraying him. Brooke didn't hesitate. Didn't call for the resident, didn't wait for an attending, didn't think about her suspension or the 4 administrators standing in the hallway. Her hands moved with 17 years of muscle memory, Sangin field hospitals where you treated what was in front of you or you watched them die on your hands. She grabbed a 14-gauge angiocath needle from the crash cart, her fingers finding the second intercostal space by touch alone, mid-clavicular line, the anatomical landmarks as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. The needle went in clean. The hiss that followed was the sound of a man's life being returned to him, that pressurized air escaping like a ghost exiting a room. Chen's oxygen saturation climbed, 75, 82, 88, 91, sinus rhythm stabilizing beneath the monitors like a prayer being answered. His shoulders dropped. His eyes cleared. The color returned to his face in waves like sunrise breaking over mountains. But that wasn't the worst part. Dr. Hargrove's voice filled the hallway before she'd even disposed of the needle. This is exactly the reckless cowboy medicine I warned you about. She's been suspended and she performed an invasive procedure without authorization. His words carried the weight of someone who'd already made phone calls, already activated his network, already moved pieces across the board in ways Brooke couldn't see. The board members flanked him like satellites orbiting a corrupted sun, their faces grave and arranged in expressions of concern that had nothing to do with Chen's recovery. She just saved his life, Jenny's voice cut through from the doorway, but Hargrove didn't even acknowledge her. Instead, he turned to the younger administrator checking his tablet with the precision of someone reading from a script they'd already rehearsed. Dr. Hargrove filed formal complaints this afternoon citing pattern of violations and boundary issues. This incident appears to confirm. This incident saved a man's life, Jenny tried again, her voice climbing toward desperation. Hargrove continued as if she hadn't spoken. A resident was present. Proper channels existed. She violated her suspension to perform a procedure that could have punctured the subclavian artery. We're looking at massive liability exposure. His eyes moved to Brooke with the satisfaction of a predator watching prey realize the trap is closing. Security will escort Ms. Sullivan out. Effective immediately. Inside the room, Chen's hand reached for her, his fingers finding her wrist with surprising strength. He mouthed the word again, lips forming the syllables like a prayer, Reaper. His eyes pleaded with her to stay, to fight, to explain. But there was nothing to explain that wouldn't collapse the entire classified architecture of her existence. Brooke gently extracted her hand. She straightened. She met Hargrove's eyes one last time, and in that moment, her face showed nothing. No anger, no fear, no desperation. Just the blank composure of someone who had already survived worse. Much worse. Sangin. Kandahar. 3 deployments where staying calm was the difference between coming home and being folded into a flag. She walked out with her head high. The security escort was almost gentle as they guided her toward the elevator. Brooke could feel the weight of Chen's watching gaze burning between her shoulder blades, and she didn't look back. In the background, Hargrove was already giving instructions to the investigators he'd personally contacted, people who owed him favors, people who would comb through her file looking for ammunition, people who had no idea they were standing next to the skeleton key to his entire operation. But that skeleton was classified. Buried. Officially erased by government order 12 years ago when they scrubbed her existence and sent her to Denver as a ghost. The investigators would find nothing but a floor nurse with 3 quiet years and a spotless record. Because everything that mattered about Brooke Sullivan had been deleted from every system that mattered. At her locker, she removed the worn combat boots and held them briefly, those boots that had walked through Sangin's dust, that had carried her through firefights and medical emergencies and the slow-motion collapse of her identity. She tucked them under her arm like a secret she was smuggling out of a country she could no longer officially defend. The drive to the Denver VA hospital took 34 minutes. She sat in her car in the parking lot for 5 minutes before going in, watching veterans move through the entrance with prosthetics and canes and that particular 1,000-yard stare that meant they understood something about survival that civilians would never quite grasp. When she finally walked through those doors, she wasn't a nurse anymore. She wasn't a provider, a professional, a woman with credentials hanging on a wall. She was a patient seeking mental health services, and the intake clerk barely looked at her as he slid the paperwork across the desk. The waiting room was half full when she found her seat. A young Marine with a prosthetic leg and tattoos mapping his forearms glanced at the boots beneath her chair and nodded slightly, that small military acknowledgement of shared experience. 2 older veterans played chess in the corner with the grim focus of men for whom strategy meant survival. A woman with a service dog sat reading a magazine, her jaw clenched in a way that suggested the magazine wasn't actually holding her attention. Brooke filled out the intake form with hands that finally, for the first time in 3 years, trembled. Not from fear. From rage. From the specific kind of fury that comes from watching someone weaponize bureaucracy and institutional cowardice against the person who'd threatened to expose him. She was invisible again. Erased again. Just another hollow-eyed veteran sitting among warriors while her own service remained classified in a basement somewhere in the Pentagon, her decorations locked in a vault, her name officially scrubbed from every deployment record and mission roster. The government had buried her to protect its secrets. Hargrove had buried her to protect his theft. And she was supposed to sit in this waiting room and wait for a therapist who would never understand that the reason she couldn't sleep wasn't combat trauma, it was knowing that a thief in a doctor's coat had won. The waiting room door opened 2 hours later, and Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Chen walked through it like a ghost returning to the living, his wife supporting his right side, for lines trailing beneath his jacket. He moved through that room like a man searching for something more valuable than his own life, and when his eyes found Brooke sitting between the two veterans with her boots under her chair, everything changed. He crossed to her in 4 strides, grabbed her hand, and whispered, "Reaper. I knew it was you." Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Chen walked through the VA waiting room doors trailing for lines like tethers, his uniform jacket draped over the tubing to hide the medical infrastructure beneath. His eyes found her immediately, not scanning, but locking. Brooke sat motionless in a plastic chair, still in her scrubs, her hands folded so tightly the knuckles had gone white. Chen crossed the room in 7 strides. His grip on her hand was firm enough to anchor her. "Reaper," he whispered, hoarse and certain. The word hung in the air like a salute. Brooke's jaw clenched once. She didn't pull away. She didn't smile. She simply held his gaze and gave the smallest nod, the kind of acknowledgement that only comes between people who have already survived impossible things together. Her voice, when she spoke, was barely audible. "You shouldn't be here." But there was no steel in it. Just fact. Just a woman watching the life she'd buried for 3 years materialize in front of witnesses who would never forget. Her son David arrived within the hour. He didn't walk into the waiting room. He moved through it like someone crossing a battlefield, uniform sharp enough to cut, dress army greens with patches that meant things only other soldiers could decode. When he saw her, his stride broke. Just for a moment. Just enough to show what it cost him to see his mother still sitting in that chair, waiting. His voice cracked before he even spoke. "Senior Chief Petty Officer. Not Mom. Not my mother." Her rank, spoken like a prayer. 12 years. 3 tours. 2 Purple Hearts. And a Navy Cross. The other people in the waiting room didn't understand what they were witnessing. They just knew that something seismic had shifted. The tired nurse in scrubs wasn't tired anymore. She was radioactive with truth. A Navy nurse practitioner named Commander Patricia Holloway stepped forward, her hands trembling as she held the unsealed file. Not shaking with fear. Shaking with the kind of awe that comes from reading about someone who walked into darkness and walked back out carrying bodies that weren't hers. Tears streamed down her face as she recounted the details, each decoration a weight, each citation another proof that the woman sitting in this waiting room had done things most people couldn't comprehend. Silver Star for pulling 3 wounded operators through a live kill zone in Sangin. She paused, her voice fracturing. Defense Superior Service Medal for coordinating a mass casualty evacuation under mortar fire. Another pause. The weight building. 2 Purple Hearts. The file trembled in her hands. And a Navy Cross. Then a SEAL team leader stepped forward from the back of the room. Call sign Bear. Scarred hands. Eyes the color of storm-darkened glass. He'd served under Brooke's command in Sangin, and when he spoke, every word landed like a verdict. He opened a duffel bag and removed Brooke's dress blues, the uniform she hadn't worn in 3 years, the one that had been officially erased from every military database when the operation went classified. Silver Star. He held it up. Silence. For pulling 3 wounded operators through a kill zone when the helicopters couldn't reach us because someone had disabled the comms. He set it down. Picked up the next one. Defense Superior Service Medal. For coordinating the evacuation of 47 personnel under sustained mortar fire when our commanding officer was incapacitated. Another medal. Another moment of silence so complete you could hear the fluorescent lights humming overhead. 2 Purple Hearts. Not questions. Statements of fact. And a Navy Cross. For operations you still can't talk about. That was when the FBI agents arrived. 2 of them, moving with the precise coordination of people accustomed to delivering information that changed things. The lead agent, Special Agent Morris, his credentials already in hand, positioned himself between Brooke and the doorway, but not as a barrier. As a shield. "Ms. Sullivan, I'm Special Agent Morris, Federal Bureau of Investigation." The operation you participated in, Sangin Valley, 2019 through 2021, has been declassified as of 2300 hours yesterday, specifically to protect you from ongoing professional retaliation. He handed her a document. Her name. Her real name. Her real title. Printed on government letterhead. Your discharge was classified. Your medical records were sealed. Your identity was buried because the government made certain mistakes in the field and buried them along with everyone involved. His voice remained level. That ends today. You're no longer invisible. Down the hallway of Mercy General, Dr. Hargrove stood in the shadows of a supply closet, his shirt collar damp with sweat. A colleague had texted him. Something about FBI agents at the VA, something about Brooke Sullivan's file being unsealed. His face had gone the color of spoiled milk. His hands shook as he tried to pull up his encrypted offshore accounts on his phone, forgetting in his panic that the Cayman's routing numbers were in his desk, at home, 3,000 miles away from the career he was about to lose. The next morning, a two-star admiral flew into Denver with dress white so crisp they could cut paper. His name was Admiral James Garrett, and his face was carved from granite. He walked into Mercy General's main lobby at 7:47 a.m., 30 seconds before the hospital's entire staff was assembled as witnesses. Every nurse. Every resident. Every administrator. Jenny stood in front with her phone recording. The Admiral's voice carried through the atrium like a command to attention. Dr. Hargrove, you are hereby notified that Senior Chief Petty Officer Sullivan's termination is void, her record cleared, and your actions constitute interference with a federal investigation. Behind him, federal marshals waited with handcuffs gleaming under the fluorescent lights. The hospital CEO stepped forward, a man named Richard Pierce whose face was tight with the kind of fury that only comes from discovering you've been betrayed by someone you trusted. Your billing records show $847,000 in fraudulent Medicare charges over 18 months. Kickbacks from Apex Medical Supply totaling $340,000. The board has voted unanimously for immediate termination and criminal referral to the Department of Justice. Pierce's voice was so quiet the room had to go dead silent to hear him. You didn't just commit fraud, Dr. Hargrove. You endangered a patient by restricting access to his primary nurse when she identified a life-threatening complication. You attempted to destroy the career of a decorated Navy SEAL to cover financial crimes. Hargrove tried to speak. His mouth opened. His lips moved. Nothing coherent came out. The Admiral cut him off with a voice that sounded like a tank idling in a garage. You attempted to destroy the career of a senior chief petty officer who served this country with more honor than you'll ever comprehend. You activated your network. You made calls. You weaponized your position to hurt someone because she threatened your money. The Admiral gestured, a single economical motion. Take him. The marshals moved forward like they'd practiced this 1,000 times. Handcuffs. Miranda Wrights read in a voice without inflection. Hargrove's expensive suit, tailor-made, $1,500, looked suddenly cheap as they walked him toward the doors. News cameras flashed outside. The entire staff watched in absolute silence. His wife served him divorce papers 3 days later. His medical license was suspended pending investigation. The 60-foot yacht he'd been planning to buy with his kickbacks was repossessed before the first payment cleared. 6 months later, Brooke drove past a strip mall in a Denver suburb and saw him, Dr. Hargrove, sitting at a folding table beneath a hand-painted sign that read, "Cut Rate Insurance," in letters that had started to peel. His expensive suit had been replaced by a rumpled polo shirt. His manicure had grown out. His eyes followed her car as it passed, and in that moment, he finally understood what real authority looked like. Not the kind you could buy with kickbacks or activate with a network of favors. The kind you earned in places like Sangin. The kind that came from saving lives when the world was on fire. 5 hours after Lieutenant Colonel Chen whispered Reaper in the VA waiting room, Brooke stood in the White House East Room, still wearing her nurse's scrubs because there hadn't been time to change. Her son David stood behind her in full army dress uniform, his chest out with a pride that needed no explanation. The president himself moved forward, not the photograph version, the real one, the one who occasionally had to authorize operations that sent people like Brooke Sullivan into places where the rules of engagement were written in blood and silence. He pinned a Defense Distinguished Service Medal to her collar with steady hands. The photographers captured the moment, Brooke shaking the president's hand, her face composed, her eyes clear. On her feet, polished to a mirror shine for the first time in 3 years, were those worn combat boots from Sangin. The ones that had sat in her locker at Mercy General. The ones that proved she'd been someone else all along. The president leaned in, and his voice was quiet enough that only Brooke and the microphones heard it. "Senior Chief, your country owes you more than we can ever repay. Thank you for your continued service, in uniform and out." Brooke returned to Mercy General the following week not as a floor nurse but as the hospital's new director of emergency nursing, her office overlooking the same unit where Hargrove had tried to destroy her. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. If you're enjoying the story so far, hit that like button. And I'd love to know, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from.